Thank you for coming in and being a part of this great session today, which is more important than ever. I think we read about it every day, and it's critical that these sorts of meetings are not just about having discussions, but also coming up with solutions, and I think that's why it's phenomenal to have such a spectacular panel here today. First of all, thank you to the Tamara Center for putting this on and for inviting us all to be here and making this a priority in our weekly schedule, our annual schedule. And thank you to Columbia University for providing the space and the services as well. But today's session, today's talk and panel focuses on what kinds of processes, peoples, and platforms are needed to break the cycle of underfunding for women's health, for therapeutics in women's health, companies, women's-led companies in that area, and my specialty and my passion, digital health, obviously, in women's health. And we know that digital is transforming healthcare. We know that digital is taking a while to transform healthcare. It's not happening overnight, it's taking some time. But at the same time, we're seeing the same trend in digital therapeutics that we have seen for decades in traditional biologic interventions, which is that women's-led companies and women's-led ventures are generally, always, systematically, not funded at levels of traditional men-led companies. And so I'm going to allow our panelists to actually introduce themselves and their backgrounds a little bit. We have a spectacular panel here of 3 women that are leaders in really different areas, and I think it'll be just a phenomenal time for us to get to know them. First, CAROLEE, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. My name is CAROLEE, and let's see, I come to you with a business background. So first of all, I'm an entrepreneur who built a company from my kitchen table a number of years ago and had the great privilege of building it to be a $50 million company and selling it to Luxottica about 25 years later. So that's before the internet was born. It gives you some chronology to it. And it was a wonderful experience of both leadership, understanding the needs of women. It was an accessories company. The company was 85% women. I had a particular interest at the time and always have in women's health and well-being, so I enrolled everyone in a health club. There was no such thing as Equinox. And I did it, and you'll see the threads of this, to keep my employees healthy and happy, and basically at work and performing at a high level. After I sold the company, what I realized was that I had a keen understanding of how women think and knew a vast number of women, and also knew that in doing some research after selling the company that women were probably going to live to be 100, and there was a great interface between health and wealth. And understanding that, and understanding that most women were not focused on either of those facts, and how long they might be employed and how much money they might need to do both of those things, I decided to launch a series of health conferences. And so being the quintessential entrepreneur, I took 30 hotel rooms out in Aspen, Colorado one summer, invited a number of people to speak, and I thought, well, if no one came, I would invite my friends, and that was really the beginning of Access Circles. So Access Circles was the entity that I created in order to bring together women to understand how to manage their health and wealth. Now I'm going to fast forward, because obviously the story is much longer and much more detailed than that, to the fact that as I was hosting for about 10 years these different conferences, what I realized was that I was leaving a lot of energy in the room. In other words, here were a vast number of significant CEOs, entrepreneurs, and we would talk about many issues that affected women's health, but we really weren't doing anything about it. And so what I decided all of 15 months ago or 16 months ago was that I needed to have a 501c3 that would actually be focused on this. And so I created WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters. The URL is whamnow.org. There's a great infographic which gives you a lot of data, which I'm going to give you a little bit of. And what I realized was that there was a huge void in women's health research and the awareness that women were an understudied species. So let me just now give you a little bit of data so that we're all on the same page. Up until 1993, women were not part of clinical trials. Up until 2018, female mice were not included in clinical trials. All of the data that I'm giving you, by the way, comes from our two partners, our two main partners. Harvard, the Connor Center, Brigham is our lead scientific partner, and Women's Health Research at Yale is our second partner in terms of the data that I'm giving you. Alzheimer's afflicts 5.7 million Americans, 2/3 are women. Women are twice as likely to get Alzheimer's as men. Twice as likely to get Alzheimer's than breast cancer over the age of 65. Depression affects women twice as frequently as men, and the data goes on. I could sit here for the next hour and spew forth data. That's not necessarily going to be the most effective use of our time, and I've got a couple of other wonderful panelists. But the fact is that women's health research is and the idea that women are an understudied species is not very broadly known. And it's also not very broadly known because, I believe, of the bias that exists throughout the systems that we all face, that all of us have faced, myself included, and I'm not going to get off necessarily for a very long time on bias. And how much time exactly?
You have an hour left. That's all you have left.
Well, I don't have an hour, but we have an hour, I guess. And so what I realized was that perhaps there was a better way or a different way to look at this. And so I set out to do three things with WHAM. The first was to create the Investigators Fund. And out in Aspen, by bringing together an extraordinary group of people, both scientists as well as some extraordinary business leaders, we raised $600,000 over that weekend, with the idea of putting it in the Investigators Fund and investing in women's health, early stage women's health research. The second thing we said we would do is to build the WHAM Collaborative. The WHAM Collaborative, the objective is to bring together the less than 15 institutions that exist in the US that have a focus on women's health research. You caught that, right? Less than 15. So it's not that there aren't individual researchers focused on women's health or specific topics, but as far as institutional support, there's less than 15. That will take place actually November 18th, 19th up at Brigham, who are actually hosting us, and we have 10 of the 15 so far joining us to kick off the collaborative and to decide how we're going to impact women's health research. If you're a member of the collaborative, you can apply to the Investigators Fund for a grant. If we give you a grant, your institution has to match it, whether in dollars or in space or in other ways. So we're also obviously trying to affect the institutions, because as you probably know, less than 16% of deans in medical schools are women. Even though this is 2018 was the first year that the numbers of medical students, female medical students surpassed male occurred, but still the amount of women in leadership positions, without again sitting here and giving you all the data, is abysmal. And we could say that the numbers of women in leadership positions generally in the world is not terrific, and especially, in my opinion, in this most developed country, right here. And the third thing that we said we would do is create the WHAM report. And the reason for that was to say that we needed data such as I'm giving to you, because this had to be, in my opinion, a data-driven conversation, not an emotional conversation. It is about inequality. It is about social justice. It is about the fact that women are an understudied species. How's that possible? You will be most likely misdiagnosed at some point in your life. You'll be given a drug that's never been tested on you. The women in this room, that is. All drugs have been tested on a 175-pound white male. Not all drugs have been tested on a female, and it goes on and on. But we don't know this data. So part of my mission, therefore, through the WHAM report, is to get that information known. But as I was trying to figure out how the WHAM report could make its greatest impact, what I started to realize was that I had to reframe how I was even thinking about the lack of women's health research. And that is that we can't think of it, in my opinion, just in terms of inequality. We can't think of it, in my opinion, just in terms of social injustice, because I don't think, when I would sit in front of many men, including many in my own sons, they would look at me and they'd say, "You've been talking about this your whole life." And it's true. So I've been talking about anything that affects women disproportionately or from an inequality perspective my whole life. And what I decided to do before our Aspen conference this summer, which actually was held in Rhode Island for a change, was to do a little research to find out what happens economically if you support women. Because women are the economic drivers of any country. More women, women-owned businesses employ more women than the Fortune 500 companies combined. Women drive all economies if you look at the data. So how is it then that I couldn't find any data that said if we accelerated women's health research, the impact on the economy, on women, on their families? Women are the chief medical officers, as you know, of the family. On their corporate workplaces, on the economy might be different. And so through a convoluted means, I was introduced to a couple of health economists at the RAND Corporation, with whom we are now partnering to create the WHAM report. And that report, which is in process, will basically show what the economic impact is on all of us, women, men, our families, if you accelerate women's health research 2 times, 3 times, and what that looks like today, 5 years from now, and 10 years from now. So I'm pretty excited because in 15 months that I would never have expected that I would have gone from point A to what we've achieved. And the other thing that I'll mention, other than understanding being an entrepreneur and building a business, is that I've been on the board of the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, which is the largest funder of breast cancer on the planet. We have about, I think, 175 researchers, I could have the number wrong, in about 23 countries, and it just goes on and on, a $66 million budget. We've raised over $600 million. And I've started in that role with the Lauder family as they launched that. So I know, that was 25 years ago. So I understand a little bit about research, understand a little bit about business. And the last piece I'll say, as part of my ecosystem that I'm building, is that eventually either we'll have our own fund or hopefully we'll partner with someone who has one, because I believe strongly that it's going to take many different means of being able to accomplish the kind of shift and the large impact that we would like to make. So.
That's awesome. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, Stacy, you're going to have to follow.
Tough act to follow. So I am Stacy BLAIN, and I have a PhD actually from Columbia, Uptown 168. I am a molecular cellular biochemist, and I have been studying breast cancer for most of my career. I have been in New York City for a long time. I was at Columbia, then I was at Sloan Kettering, where I sort of launched my breast cancer career, and now I am a faculty member at one of the SUNYs, the Downstate Medical Campus in Brooklyn. I might teach him. And there I run an academic lab that is funded by the National Institute of Health and the Susan G. Komen and the American Cancer Society, and I work primarily on breast cancer by trying to figure out how cells become cancerous and how can we stop them. And I am a reluctant entrepreneur in the sense that about 5 years ago, we patented several technologies that we thought had very high significance. One was a diagnostic that we thought could be used for breast cancer, and the other is a very novel way to deal with metastatic breast cancer, which is still about 40,000 US women will die this year from this disease. So still a very big issue, and essentially an issue that we haven't really moved the needle on significantly. That number is pretty static for the last several decades. So we have a very novel way of doing this, and I have been sort of on the front lines of receiving money to do my research, and via conversations with the NIH, they actually said, you know, you can't develop a drug as an academic. You have to do this in the corporate setting. You need to start a company, and I knew nothing about companies. I didn't even know what a cap table was. I didn't know what an addressable market was, but I am a quick learner, and I surrounded myself with very good co-founders who knew a lot of these things, and I started Concarlo Holdings now 2.5 years ago at the Downstate Biotechnology Incubator in Brooklyn. And in the last 2.5 years, we have been raising money for our 2 technologies. And we have attacked both, friends and family, angels, ventures, as well as impact funding. We work a lot on triple negative breast cancer, which essentially is the worst type of breast cancer that you could get, and essentially is being treated the exact same way it was treated in the last 40 years. We have no new therapeutics. This is also a disease that predominantly affects African American women, which is the patient population that we see primarily in our hospital in Brooklyn. So I run, I think I span all aspects of women's health right now. I do research in the academic setting. I run 3 clinical trials with our African American cohorts at the hospital there. I also am an entrepreneur raising money, and I will say, and I think this is the point of this panel, it's difficult to raise money for women's health. It's difficult still to raise money for breast cancer. We were talking earlier that only about 2% of all venture money goes to women-run companies, and very little goes into women's health. My husband jokes, it's easier to raise money to get an app to get a hamburger delivered to my house than to actually change the way we deal with breast cancer. So I'm eager to interact with these 2 very talented women, because I am on the front lines to raise money both in the private sector as well as in the academic sector.
Perfect, thank you. And Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Butler, and I am president of the Cavendish Impact Foundation. So I come to the world of health not through scientific training like Stacy, but rather through entrepreneurship. So 20 years ago, I co-founded a company called Asthma Magazine. It was a patient education publication focused on delivering unbiased information to asthma and allergy patients. At the time, I had a son who I could not keep out of the hospital, who had severe asthma and allergies, and I thought, well, if I, as an educated person, cannot keep my son out of the hospital, then there must be a real lack of unbiased and quality education out there for managing this disease. So co-founded this patient education publication, and 5 years later sold the company to Elsevier Health Sciences, and then stayed on as editor-in-chief there for another 5 years. I came to Cavendish Impact Foundation with great enthusiasm, because it brings together my real interest in health, in philanthropy, and in supporting companies that are doing really important work. So Cavendish Impact Foundation is a 501c3 organization that brings together or aggregates philanthropic funding to then be used for investing in early stage health and life science companies that, most importantly, are focusing on meeting an unmet medical need. So there are a number of areas that we've identified as particularly in need of impact investing in the space, and that are underfunded. So these verticals that we focus on are one being pediatric health, in particular orphan diseases or rare diseases that just don't get the funding. We also focus on brain health, mental health in particular. There have been only 5 new therapeutics in mental health in the last 30, 40 years that are truly novel, and very little funding and going into that right now. And the third being women's health, which we've also identified as an area that really is truly underfunded. I actually met Stacy as we're looking to invest in her company, Concarlo, which is just doing great work in the area of breast cancer. So I think that is an introduction.
That's fantastic. And while you're on the floor now, could you actually give us a little bit more detail about some of the challenges you've seen really on both sides of the coin, the fundraiser and also the funder, that you're seeing, and on a more detailed anecdotal perspective basis?
So in women's health, well, certainly women's health is an underfunded area, and so there's a lot of question as to why this is. Obviously, as Stacy alluded to, well, I guess to just step back, when you're dealing with a health company, there's typically a long period of time. I mean, you have health companies that are service focused that can get to a revenue stage earlier, but typically in health and life science, you've got companies that are either developing a medical device, a therapeutic, or a diagnostic. STACY's actually developing 2 out of 3 of those. So a medical device and a diagnostic tend to get to market or get to commercial and revenue stage a little more quickly in maybe 2 to 5 years, what you say is correct. But a therapeutic can be, 10 years, and it can cost anywhere from, 50 million to hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to develop it. So in a health-focused company, generally, you really need to have funding available to get these companies through to the point where they can, get FDA approval and be in a position to have revenue. So, so just generally, it's incredibly important. So in areas that are underfunded, like women's health, I mean, these companies will die on the vine. You have, often the technology is developed in the laboratory and research institutions. It spins out. And then, first they may get some initial grants from the institution or from the NIH. After that, maybe some friends and family money when no one else believes in them except their friends and family. And then, seed money. And that's where Cavendish Impact Foundation comes in. But what's this? Once you get past friends and family, there's something called the valley of death. There's very few funding sources. And so companies that have great technologies that are incredibly important and need to be able to get to market, they die on the vine due to the lack of funding. So why is women's health less well-funded than others? Well, one problem is that 90% of venture capital, people who work in venture capital are men. Not that they don't have good intentions and want to fund, but often, and their studies have shown that men don't see, it's a cultural thing, men don't necessarily see areas of women's health as being particularly important, as a problem that needs solving often. Yet the other thing is that women-run companies only get 2.5% of venture capital, and only 17% of companies that are funded by venture capitalists are run by women. So in women's health, 28% of the companies are run by women. So right there, if you do the math, you see that there's a funding problem. So I guess that's just some of the issues that are challenges when people are trying to raise money for a company developing something in women's health. And I just wanted to say also, and I think CAROLEE alluded to this, but women's health isn't just reproductive health. I think people think about that it's, a new type of breast pump or something for menopause. Reproductive health is an important part of it, but women's health is really defined as anything that affects women differently than it affects men. So Alzheimer's, women get Alzheimer's at twice the rate of men. Autoimmune disorders, 80% of people with autoimmune disorders are women. This is becoming a huge problem because now you have these new immunotherapies that are being used for cancer treatments. Well, many women have to drop out of treatment, and there's no other option available to them. Everyone talks about the Jimmy Carter, miracle. Well, there are many women who benefit from it, but it triggers such terrible autoimmune disorders that they can't continue treatment, and they have no options. So that's an area of women's health. Depression and anxiety. Women have twice the rate of depression and anxiety as men. So anyway, that's some of the sort of background on the issues.
That's spot on. It's so perfect too, because one of the things that HitLab does is run something called the Women's Health Tech Challenge. It's a competition every 6 months in New York, in San Francisco, in New Delhi, India, and it runs programs to help provide more funding, more exposure, more press around these issues in the startups. And what you're talking about, Rachel, around that valley of death is incredible. To go from friends and family to institutional funding is absolutely devastating. It's so difficult to break that chain. And you can see it just in digital health because there's 4,000 companies, 4,000 funds funding digital health right now. But when you Google top funds for women's health tech and women's-led companies, there's 15. It's insane. Avestria, there are a lot of funds out there, the work that you guys are doing, but it's incredible just how the paucity right now of women's-led venture funds. And I think, Stacey, if you could tell us a little bit, again, coming from academia, coming into startup, there's a lot of friction. There's a lot of friction for women to start the company, to get the funding, move out of friends and family, like Rachel's talking about. Having done that now, what advice can you give to people in this room, people watching online, to help reduce that friction? Are there institutions, are there tactics, techniques, technologies, whatever, that you'd recommend entrepreneurs with women's health tech companies do that?
Persevere. I mean, that would be the thing I would say is, you have to talk to a lot of people, and you have to get someone so that your idea resonates with them. I think the biggest thing with women's health is that people are nervous about taking chances frequently, right? This is, if you're developing therapeutics, as Rachel was saying, this is a long process. This is not, I'm not going to make anybody any money very quickly. And I could be 100% right. I could cure cancer in animals and dogs and rats, and that doesn't necessarily translate into humans. However, that has sort of crippled our industry and made people very risk adverse. I've spent a lot of time over the last year talking to Pfizer and Eli Lilly and a lot of big companies, and they love our idea, but they want more data. They want more. Can you show me more? Can you get me this? And that's great, but I have to pay for that, and biomedical research is expensive. So when I started out, we raised a lot of money via friends and family. We also received some funding from the New York State Economic Development Corp, which is really trying to create a more active biospace in New York City to rival that in California or Boston. So that was great. And then we are now doing a lot of impact investing because of the idea that we need people to believe in our vision. We have a radical way of doing something, so it is going to be, people have to buy into what we're trying to do and have to believe. And I think the biggest challenge is to convince people that this is an issue that affects everyone. Everyone has mothers and sisters and daughters, and eventually we all will know someone affected by this disease. And we need to change the paradigm. I frequently talk to people and they say to me, breast cancer, haven't we solved that problem, right? Is that still a big issue? Yes, it is for the 40,000 women that will die this year and the countless others that will go through very costly, painful therapies. I'm not saying that we haven't made great strides, but I think to rest on our laurels would be a mistake. So I think we are talking now a lot to angel investors, we talk a lot to venture investors, because as we were talking, this valley of death, it's very difficult to make the leap to strategic partners in the pharma industries until you get further through that valley. And so that is tricky. I think that makes health in general, women's health in particular, a bigger challenge.
And CAROLEE, you've already started many initiatives and been a leader out there about trying to bring this your whole life, as you said earlier, to the front of press and to the front of headlines and the front of institutional leaders. What are the leading initiatives aside from your own that, again, people in this room and watching online can go to for assistance, can go to for support, and to try to find, again, ways to reduce that friction from a societal, a systemic standpoint?
It's a good question. I mean, one of the things that I feel very strongly about is collaboration. And early on, I realized that I had to get to know NIH and the Foundation for NIH and something called the Office for Women's Health Research. Actually, it's the Office for Research on Women's Health, ORWH. And to that extent, I did get to know all of those people because, remember, I wanted data, and the data is there. They collect that data. And remember, NIH is the largest funder of research on the planet. And you have to include males and females in your study. You're supposed to report by sex, but not everyone does. There's a whole universe out there of people that collaboratively we all need to tap into in order to fix this. It's not going to be just one means of fixing it. And government, obviously, and NIH is one of them. The other thing that I think I feel strongly about, especially for women and to create an impact, is not only mentorship, but sponsorship in institutions. Because if you look at the numbers, remember I think I gave you 16% of the deans in medical schools are women. That's pitiful. And so if we're talking about a leadership change, And then we could get to how many chairs and all the others. And the numbers are abysmal when you start looking at all this data. And so you have to kind of scratch your head. And this is why I think I said earlier, what we're trying to do at WHAM is to figure out how do we shift the conversation? Because it's not going to be a good one if we keep talking about it's unequal, it's social injustice, it's, you know, women are just not and we're misdiagnosed. That's one way to look at it. The other way, I believe, which might be much more prophetic and have a much bigger impact, is how do I fund women's health research then? How do I take it from this abysmal state it is to what the RAND Corporation is working on, and hopefully they're going to give us a lot of these answers. Like, how could you accelerate funding in the 4 areas that we're interested in, which Rachel alluded to? We don't touch maternal or reproductive. There's fortunately, a pretty large body of research and data in that realm. What we're focused on are 4 areas that will afflict a woman in her lifetime: autoimmune, brain health, cancer, and cardiovascular. As much as I am the biggest proponent of breast cancer on the planet and have spent 25 years on it, I will also sit here and tell you lung cancer kills more women than all the female cancers combined, breast, ovarian, and cervical. And lung cancer, by the way, the cancer that kills women is women who don't smoke. And yet the amount of research is abysmal. I'm not going to start giving you all these numbers. So how do we shift that? How do we shift the awareness to the diseases that afflict women exclusively, predominantly, disproportionately, differentially, however you'd like to describe it, because women have diseases differently than men. So I think a lot of this has to do with how we're taking in this data, and then how we're trying to, with people much smarter than ourselves, trying to figure out how maybe we shift the conversation, therefore accelerating the amount of research that can be done. And that ultimately then has the impact on us economically.
That's fantastic. And I know a lot of you are queuing up for questions and answers. In about 10 minutes, we're going to jump to that phase of the panel. But circling back over to Rachel, and again, with all the good work you're doing at the Cavendish Impact Foundation, I think one of the things when teaching, especially in talking with professionals like yourselves in the audience here today, is what can you learn about today from this panel that you can go back to your office on Monday morning and apply? So what kind of information can you gather today that can be specifically applicable, help you do something impactful Monday morning? So let's talk a little bit about that, Rachel. What specific funds or what specific funding sources, we talked a little bit about NIH, and we talked, certainly everyone knows about SBIR, but what are some other funds that we know that there are more and more funds coming out that are focusing on women's health, but could you provide some specifics around that since you're so tied to that community?
So there is one bright spot in funding of women's health is something called femtech, which is a recently coined phrase, and it's basically is again focused on, typically it's reproductive health and it's technologies that can support women's health in this area. So tends to be dealing with pregnancy and fertility tracking and menopause symptoms and that sort of thing. It has really become sort of a hot area. So in 2014, there was $100 million of venture funding in this area. Now it's pushing close to $1 billion in 2019. So that's a sort of a bright area, but that's really the only area that's really been focused on with venture funding. There is a new, it's not a new type of funding, but it's an interesting type of funding that is growing, and Cavendish Impact Foundation is in this area called venture philanthropy. So we are doing something I think a little bit unique, but it is a growing area anyway. So many of the foundations that had only been giving grants for research until recently are now creating venture funds that they use philanthropic money that's donated to their foundation, and they fund early stage companies. So, and they take equity for that. So as long as the company is aligned with the mission of the foundation, they can do impact investing and equity funding of a for-profit company using nonprofit money. So a great example of that is the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and this is actually what made everyone decide this was a really good idea, because 20 years ago they did something very novel, and they invested in a technology, an early stage company, and fast forward 20 years, it was bought by Vertex Pharmaceutical, and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation got $3 billion. So now every foundation, disease-focused foundation, is like, we can do that. Well, we should really focus on that. So what we do at Cavendish is we're not focused on a specific disease state. So we work with high net worth individuals, other foundations, corporate entities that have a philanthropic component, and we bring in philanthropic funding, we aggregate it, and then we go out and do the hard work, and investing in early stage health and life science companies is very hard work. It's a very difficult area to invest in because there is so much unknown. Is this study that looked good in mice going to look good in pigs, or, you know, or going to do well in their first human trials, or, you know, is the market for this device really, you know, strong, and how will it do? So we see a need, particularly in these three areas that I mentioned earlier, women's health being one of them, but also just generally in early stage companies working toward unmet medical need. And so by bringing philanthropic funding into this ecosystem, it's really bringing a whole new type of funding that didn't exist for the most part 10 years ago. And so if you know, as an entrepreneur, if you're looking, and I think Stacy alluded to this, you know, this is a new type of funding that is worth looking into, and especially these disease-focused foundations that are all starting to put venture funds together.
That's fantastic. And to keep the points coming in terms of things that you can apply when you get back to your desk Monday morning, let's go to Stacy, who's also a professor at downstate and has seen a lot of attrition, I'm sure, in women in STEM, women entrepreneurs who are trying to do things. There's so much friction, they're dropping out. What recommendations do you have to this audience, and again, people online who can make a difference when they go back to work Monday? What can they do to help reduce that kind of attrition that you're seeing?
So, you know, if you look at the number of PhD candidates and medical school candidates in the United States, there's actual gender parity. We have this equal women, if not in many instances more. But as you move up the food chain from that level, that educational level, to where I am now, which is a tenured faculty member, you see there's attrition along the way. And the actual number of women faculty level, at the tenured faculty level in this country is under 40% in the sciences. So I think that is something that, you know, we need to change. And why are women leaving this industry? And I think that it is our responsibility to change the way we recruit women and change the way that we look at women as candidates. I sit on the board of the molecular biology department for Princeton University, and they made a commitment several years ago to increase their number of women faculty. And one of the ways that they did that was they said when they receive applicants, they would interview every woman candidate, right? And because that maybe the women will look differently on paper than the men. And I think there's evidence for that. The average age of a woman getting tenure in the United States is significantly higher than men. For example, myself, I had maternity leave extension because I have 3 children, and so my university gave me extra time on my tenure clock to deal with that. It was a programmed sort of slowing down of my research to take care of my reproductive needs. So I look differently on paper than my male colleague of the same age. He's going to be further along than I am. And I think that it's a recognition that, you know, talking about things you can take back, recognizing that the arc of a woman's career is going to be different, and that we need to be able to incorporate that to keep these young, talented women that I see in the classroom, in the PhD candidates in the medical school classroom where I run the cancer block. We need to keep them in the conversation, because if we can change that, as you were saying, if we have more women on the faculty, more women deans, more women sitting in the room when I'm presenting my pitch or my research, the likelihood that I will be funded is much higher. So I think it starts for everyone keeping the number of women active, and so that at these higher administrative and senior positions that we are achieving gender parity, because we are still not, and that will in fact translate down into the way we fund differently.
That's great. That's really, that's sort of, those sorts of programmatic, even if they're incremental, can lead to bigger changes societally, especially if everyone in this room goes out and tells 5 people, look, this is what needs to happen. So, CAROLEE, your data-driven, charismatic start, hoping you can wind us to the Q&A session with another data-driven, charismatic answer around building on what Stacy talked about, with reducing the friction and with women entrepreneurs, whether moving from PhD to senior academic positions. What else? What other initiatives out there? What are some of the other models for programs that you've seen, either academic or industry side or venture side, to help women that want to lead in those, and we can reduce that attrition? What do you see out there that's working today?
Well, I think there are a number out there that are working today, and without getting into all of them, what I think what I would encourage everyone to do is to start thinking about the models that they know that do work in other industries that perhaps could be applied to what it is that we're talking about. So one of the things that WHAM is very focused on, as I said earlier, is we're basically business people. So we're trying to look with a business lens at how do we shift this discussion? How do we change that platform? How do we change, to the best that we can, the amount of bias that exists? So, and those are all obviously big goals, but how can we, each of us, look at the different either organizations that we belong to? So I have, throughout my career, belonged to a number of business women's organizations. I've led several. I am taking those models to try to apply them to what we're doing because, like I mentioned earlier, the idea of not only mentorship but sponsorship. I need to sponsor every woman in this room to the extent that I can to get them to the next level. That's what Stacy was just talking about. Each of us would need to be looking at a model that we can adapt and adopt to apply to this so that we get both this information and this awareness of the lack of research and the ultimate economic impact it could make if we accelerated it by using those models that have worked for us perhaps in different industries. I know that's a kind of maybe a broad way to think about it, but you all come from different perspectives and different vantage points. So I think we all need to tap into those particular models that we're familiar with and say, how might that apply?
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And let's go to the Q&A component of the panel. We will need a mic for you all, and we've got a couple of folks here that are going to help out with that. So if you can conjure up some questions, raise your hands, and Ivy's going to pass the mic around. And again, we want to wait until you have the mic in your hand before you ask it, so that they can capture it on video and online, on demand. You are all going to be famous in about 24 hours when this goes online.
This is mostly for Ms. Butler, but also for everyone. Do you see promise in public-private partnerships in the healthcare space, and is that something that you've been working on at the Cavendish Foundation?
We haven't so much focused on that, but I definitely think that that's an area that holds promise for funding in this particular space, but it isn't something that we've worked on too much, although actually we actually just yesterday had a meeting with a group that promotes business for a certain country, and obviously governments and the various government institutions are looking to make sure that their entrepreneurs and are going to be successful. So there's certainly opportunity there to build funds and funding for people in these developing early stage companies, and certainly in women's health.
Wonderful. I think we have a question here, and then a question or rubbing your head? Okay.
Hi, I'm Joy Williams. I am founder of really early stage, and we are working on trying to address some of the biases that Black women have. In particular, these biases and the health disparities that Black women have are irrespective of income, and a lot of times the solutions that we see are focused on solving this low income gap. So being in those very early stages of trying to do this initial funding and seed rounds of, so what are besides perseverance, the things that we should do to focus to get some of those initial funding? For just
I can just jump in to say that if 2.5% of venture capital goes to women, 0.7% goes to women of color. So it's a huge issue.
There's a number of organizations that you could look into and belong to, and I'd be happy to send them to you that I think are helpful. Intersectionality and the study of different ethnicities and race in how disease afflicts each of us is very important. It's something that we are very focused on. I think it's just incredibly hard with that. Again, I think data is very key. And I recognize how difficult it is. This is why I keep coming back to collaboration and knowing who's out there in terms of what organizations. I remember when I first had to raise money, for example, for my business, it was abysmal. That, you know, it's a while ago. And at least today, and there were no business organizations, actually, entrepreneur organizations for women, or so few. So I just think that today there are lots of ways, and I'll be happy to network with you. But I think each of us has to be supportive and find those different means. And yes, perseverance is a big part.
I was just going to add that another bright spot in this space is that there are increasingly funds being put together with the express purpose of not only supporting women but supporting non-traditional entrepreneurs. So, you know, for women specifically, like Goldman Sachs just announced $500 million in funding. You know, but there are many smaller funds that are being created now to address this issue. It hasn't really done much because actually, if you look at the venture funding for women-led companies in 2017, it was 2.5. In 2018, it actually came in at 2.2, according to PitchBook. But you know, so it's pretty stagnant right now. But there is a lot of noise out there, a lot of good things happening, a lot of people talking about the problem. But you know, if you're looking for funding, not just funds specific to women, but funds specific to, you know, women or, you know, non-traditional entrepreneurs generally. So a little Google search could help there, I think, too. And
I would actually also add that as abysmal as research is on women, research in minorities is even worse. And so, for example, in the breast cancer space, a class of drugs that is really a game changer, you know, 90% of the patients were Caucasian women. And so we don't actually really even know how these drugs work in African American women, given the fact that their biology is actually quite different. But as a bright spot, I would say the NIH has recognized this paucity of data, and actually there is a fair amount of diversity-based research. So perhaps you could tie in at the public at the federal level, because that is a really well-funded area of research right now, given the fact that there is not much money in the NIH to begin with. That is sort of a bright spot in there. So I might actually take that avenue. I work in a hospital, as I said, where 95% of our patients are African American or African Caribbean, and our hospital has been really successful at a lot of these outreach programs, recognizing that these are different populations, and the way to reach those populations is not the same as it was traditionally to reach our Caucasian populations. And so I think that, again, if you look, there are lots of these organizations that you might be able to tap into, and you might be able to get some extra funding that way. And this is more in the public sector, but I think they are now moving a lot into funding these private companies as well.
I think we have a follow-up here.
At Kings County, we have the Arthur Ashe Center for Diversity Research and Diversity Outreach. So that's, I think, a very good place that you maybe should start.
I'll Alessandro. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for speaking today, and thank you for moderating. My name is Alessandro Ciari. I come from the CUNY School of Public Health, and I work with them on developing an incubator that's focused on public health entrepreneurship. And what you're mentioning about funding life sciences and health-based ventures and early stage sides of it is really interesting to me, and something that we really are targeting in terms of the development of companies. And I'm wondering how you have positioned yourself to take on the risk of earlier stage ventures, and what stage you usually come in, because you mentioned kind of the valley of death. Is it right then when you sort of come in? And also, how do you demonstrate the ROI for working with these kinds of companies to people that partner with you and people that perhaps fund your organization?
So that's a great question. So one of the things that's really nice about our model of using philanthropic funding for these early stage companies is that this is money that was already planned to be given away. So it may have already been put into a family foundation, and they've already gotten their tax breaks from doing that. Maybe in a donor advised fund, which is an area that is growing exponentially. There's now I think $140 billion sitting in donor advised funds that is just already had the tax advantages. It's sitting there ready to be given away. And typically, the high net worth individual or the person who's put it in there, had perhaps sold a business or needed to get the tax break immediately, but didn't really know yet what he wanted to do philanthropically, or she, with all that money. So this is money that has already been, gotten the tax advantage. It's already been earmarked to be given away. So it's inherently it has a much higher tolerance for risk. So when an individual supports Cavendish Impact Foundation and gives us money to put into our impact fund, we keep them engaged. We listen to their areas of interest. We do impact reporting on specific metrics that are set up at the beginning of, when we initially, invest in a company. We have different metrics that we'll be measuring so that we can report back to our funders generally how the companies are doing on impact, as well as how they're doing on financial. So if there is an exit and if there's a return on an investment, that goes back into the fund to be used for yet more impact. So it's actually a really nice model using philanthropic funding for this purpose, because the issue with investing in early stage is it is very high risk. And so when you're beholden to your limited partners in a venture fund, it's harder to take that risk of investing in early stage companies. So venture philanthropy is a great model for that. And I think there were other parts to your question, but I'm not sure what those were. Yeah, so, right.
That's right. We have one more question just behind Ivy right there. All right. One more, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, I'm Monica Keeney. I'm currently a student at Mailman, and I also have an MBA. I spent about 12 years on Wall Street as a researcher. So first, I want to thank you so much. I learned a ton in this hour. It was very impactful for me personally. I had a question that was maybe pretty basic, but as a business person, I look and think, women are half the population, if not more, and you would think that there's so many economic incentives for someone to see the opportunity in this. So aside from the fact that women aren't as proportionate decision makers, is there some opaqueness in the market that somehow they don't see the economic incentive of studying these problems? It seems such a basic, obvious thing. So is it really boil down to sort of biases in decision making, or is there something about the problems that they're not somehow either being communicated enough, or it just is mind-boggling to me that we're talking about this.
I actually have a funny story that maybe it's funny, maybe it's not, but also, and I think you, CAROLEE, were talking about the whole idea of looking at the economic impact, which sort of addresses that as well. But I was on the phone with a CEO of a company that she was the founder, and she was developing a new type of what's it called? The breast pump. So she said she had pitched this room full of men, and one of them said in response that he was hesitant to invest in this because, and this is a quote, he didn't want to be talking about icky stuff at the Monday morning meeting. And I'm like, well, first of all, the fact that he even let that come out of his mouth shows that he did not have sensitivity training. But I think that's icky stuff. But I think that speaks to a larger problem of there's this cultural piece of a lack of comfort. And you know, again, being a venture capital investor, you know, it's high risk and you're beholden to your investors. So you want to invest in things you understand, things you're comfortable with, things you see as a problem. Well, a new type of breast pump isn't necessarily something that a man sees as a problem because they haven't been, you know, sequestered in the utility closet at work with this very noisy machine and then having to leave it in the refrigerator where everyone sees it, you know, so he doesn't see it as a problem. So it's a cultural issue. It's not that men are insensitive or vindictive or in any way trying to ignore these issues of women's health. It's just something that more women need to be VCs, for one thing. 90% of venture capital firms or of people in venture capital are men.
That's great. Stacey, Carolee, add on?
Yeah, I have the same reaction that you have. How is this possible that we're sitting here talking about this? I think that was why when I went to do research just about 2 months ago to find who has studied the economic impact of accelerating women's health research in a developed country. And the answer is no one, which I also find, how is that possible? David Bloom up at Harvard has studied, and many of us know about the economic impact of investing in women in underdeveloped or developing countries. It's huge because women take care of their families. Women are the medical officers. Women send their kids to school. They don't spend it on alcohol or other things, which often their men might. So how is this possible that there isn't anything? That's why I'm partnering with RAND to do that study, because and that's why I think we all need to figure out ways to change it. I think Rachel's comment, this fellow's comment, I'm not sure when we say whether it's cultural or not. I personally, there's great work by a woman up at the University of Wisconsin, Molly Carnes, who talks about bias in the medical environment and the health environment. And there are others who obviously have studied bias, unintended and intended. And honestly, I think whether we call bias a cultural factor or not, I think a lot of this boils down to bias, intended or unintended, which is rampant. And so that's why my feeling is that if we all want to create a tremendous impact and a tremendous change, we need to change how we talk about things. We need to change how we view things. We need to change how we view each other, male or female, how we think about male or female. But the fact remains that women are different down to the cellular level. And if we don't understand that, and if we're heading towards precision medicine, you can't have precision medicine if you haven't studied women. So how is this possible that women are not studied? And that, I think, then says, how do we change that so that we change the landscape and do it in a way that it isn't cultural, racial inequality, but has a different tenor.
I'll be giving the time up by Ivy here, but I do want to thank Ivy for putting this together. It's a great panel and a great audience. Thank you, everybody.